Okay, so we left off talking about those benchmarks. So we're going to take a look, as promised, at how do we use those benchmarks to calculate some percents. We looked at calculating 10%, 1%, 50%, and 5%. And there's actually a lot we can do with those. Let's just first take a number and find those percents. So let's say we are looking at the number 5,280. What's 10% of that number going to be? 528. So 10%, remember, just moving the decimal point over one spot, or dividing by 10. What's 1% of 5,280 going to be? Careful. 52.8 is 1%. Right? So 1% is 1 out of 100, or moving, dividing by 100 or moving the decimal point 2 spots. 50%, 2640. Half of it, dividing by 2. Now, with a big number like that, that's kind of difficult. Now, 5%, the way we did it was we found 10% and then cut it in half. But there's another way we could have done it. We could have found 50% and then did 10% of that. Either way, it's going to come out to be 264. Very good. Once we have the 50%, 5% is easy. Just move the decimal point over a spot. So we have those benchmarks. From those benchmarks, let's find 13% of 5,280. Well, 13% can be thought of as 10% and 3 1%, right? So 10%, 528, 1% is 52.8. And all three times will be 52.8. So all we have to do is add them up. 686.4 is what we come up with, right? Now that example wasn't maybe the simplest one I could have done. I could maybe do one like this that would be easier. 21% of 5,280. The 21% would be 10, 10, and 1, right? So that's 528, 528, and 52.8. If I add those up, $1,108.8 is 21% of 5280. $49% of 5,280. Well, 49%, you can think of it as 4 10s and 9 1s, but that's not very easy. There are 4 10s, a 5, and 4 1s. But I'm going to think of it as this. 50% minus 1%. 50% was 2640. 1% is 5280. Now we can subtract. That's going to give us 2,587.2. Now looking at this, there is some work to it. But if you're totally stumped on dealing with percents, it is one way to approach it. Any percent out there you can find by using these benchmarks. It's just a combination of 10%, 1%, 50%, and 5%. Actually, you could do it with 10% and 1% if you wanted to. It's just a lot of adding and subtracting. Now, with that said, obviously that's not going to be the only way we do this. And there's a direct way to find the exact percent without having to do all the adding and subtracting and stuff like that. And it goes back to that proportion we're talking about. When we turned 3/4 into a percent, said 3 out of 4 is blank out of 100. and we cross multiply it and divide it. 3 times 100 is 300. We divide it by 4, we get 75. Well, every percent problem can be put into a proportion like this. The percent is out of 100, and then there are other numbers that match up with them. So we might have something like blank is 30% of 90. So when we look at this, I always start with the percent. So we have 30%, and that is going to be 30 out of 100. Now on the other side of our proportion, we need to match up the numbers. One of the numbers, there's going to be two other numbers. In this case, we have the blank and the 90. One of them is going to match up with the 30%, and one of them is going to match up with the 100. Now before we get too far in it, what does the 100 represent? Well, 100 is thought of almost like, actually not almost, just like 100%. 100% is the whole thing, or the starting amount. So here, 30 is representing a piece of the whole amount, sometimes referred to as the portion. The 100 is the whole amount, or the base amount, what we start with. If we look at the wording in the problem, blank is 30%. So that missing number, the blank, matches up with the 30. Over here it says of 90. You can think of that as reading out of 90, which implies the 90 goes on bottom. Just like this is 30 out of 100, this is blank out of 90. And now how do we find our missing number? Cross multiply and divide. 30 times 90 is 2,700. Divide by 100 is 27. So 27 is 30% of 90. What is 160% of 70? So to set this up, of course, again, I start with the percent. What's my percent going to be here? 160%, so that's going to be written as 160 over 100. On the other side, we have two numbers. We have a missing number and we have the 70. Which one goes with the 160? What is? Blank is 160. The missing number goes with 160. Of 70, again, think of it as out of 70, which implies the 70 goes on bottom. Now what do? Cross multiply and divide. 160 times 70 is 11,200. Good. Divided by 100 is 112. So 112 is 160% of 70. How about this one? First of all, where am I going to start? 70%, so 70 over 100. Very good. Now this one's worded way differently, but it's actually a very similar problem. Look at this. Yeah, there you go. Blank over 80. 70% of 80, you can think of it as out of 80, implies that the 80 goes on bottom. If I leave that part out and I read the rest of it, 70% is blank. So that missing number, the blank, matches up with the 70. So it does make sense to have the blank there. So now, of course, we're going to cross multiply and divide. 70 times 80 is 5,600, and we divide by 100 to get 56. So 70% of 80 is 56. So far, all three of those problems have been the same form. So let's shake it up a little bit. Here, 32 is blank percent of 40. Now, I said before that I always start with the percent. But in this problem, we don't have the percent. what are we going to do? Yeah, we're still going to start with the percent. It's just blank over 100. Now on the other side, we have the two numbers, 32 and 40. One of them matches up with our missing percent. Which one will it be? 32. 32 is blank percent. 32 matches up with our missing percent. Then of 40, again, you can think of out of 40. Now we're still going to cross multiply and divide. It's just a different direction. Now the diagonal is this direction. So 100 times 30 is 3,200. Divide by 40 is 80. So 80 out of 100, or 80%. 32 is 80% of 40. We could also have it worded 96 is what percent of 80? Now again, we're missing the percent, so I'm going to start out with blank over 100. On the other side, what's going to go on top? What's going to go on bottom? 96 over 80. Good. This is of 80, so think of that as out of 80. Implies the 80 goes on bottom. 96 is what percent? Implies the 96 goes with the missing percent. Now what do? Cross multiply what two numbers? 100 times 96 is 9,600. And then divide by 80 is 120. So 96 is 120% of 80. Now it makes sense. 96 is bigger than 80, so it has to be more than 100%. Because 100% would be the whole thing. Blank percent of 30 is 6. So again, missing the percent, so it's blank out of 100. On the other side, we have the 30 and the 6. Which one goes on top? 6. This of 30, again, implies out of 30, so the 30 should be on bottom. So we multiply what? 100 times 6 is 600, and then divide by 30 to get 20. 20% of 30 is 6. This one's a little bit different again. 42 is 60% of blank. Well, now we have the percent again. So 60% is 60 out of 100. On the other side, what do we put in there? 42 is 60%, implies the 42 goes with the 60. Of blank implies out of blank, so the blank goes on bottom. So then what? 100 times 42 is 4,200, and then divide by 60 to get 70. So 42 is 60% of 70. So here, 25% of blank is 13. So we have the percent. So we start out 25%, 25 out of 100. On the other side, we have the blank and the 13. Which one goes on top? 13. Of blank implies out of blank, implies the blank goes on bottom. Then if you read the rest, 25% is 13. That makes sense. The 13 goes to the 25. Then what? Cross multiply. 100 times 13 is 1,300, and divide by 25 is 52. So 25% of 52 is 13. Okay, so we did each of these by the percent. The reason I love by the proportion. I love the proportion method because once you get the numbers in the right place, it's always cross multiply and divide. Now it might be a little bit different positioning. You know, here we multiplied this direction divided by this number. Here we multiplied the same direction, but we divided by a number in a different spot. And of course, these first few, we cross multiplied this way and divided by the other number. The only number that's always there is 100. Any of the other three numbers can be missing. But it's always, the calculation will always be cross multiply and divide. Some of you may have been taught a method called the rate method. In the rate method of percents, and your textbook goes over this a little bit. In the rate method of percent, your percent is always turned into a decimal. And then you'll multiply. They define something called the portion and the base and stuff like that. And we use those words out there because there are things that are the portion or a piece of the whole amount. Then there's the base, which is the starting amount. Whatever matches up with the 100 is the base or the original amount, starting amount, the base amount. But anyway, in the rate method of percents, we turn our percent into a rate or a decimal. So 30% is going to become 0.3. And then for a problem like this, we would do the 90 times 0.3 is 27. And that is the answer we had. So for the second one, what's our percent in this one? 160%. That's going to become what as a decimal? Careful. 1.6. So calculating that would be 70 times 1.6, which is going to give us 112. Now you might be thinking that almost looks easier. And on those problems it was. The problem is it's not always find the decimal and then multiply. I'm going to scroll down to these last two again. So 60% is 0.6 or 0.60, however you want to word it. But I'm not going to take 42 times 0.6. I'm going to take 42 divided by 0.6 to get the 70. Because what I was given was not the base amount, it was the portion or the piece, the final result. So we were working backwards to get to what we started with. The 70 is where we started. 25%, of course, is going to be what as a decimal? 0.25. So now in this problem, what are we going to do with the 0.25? It's not going to be 13 times 0.25. It'll be 13 divided by 0.25 to get the 52. Again, we get the same answer. We just have to figure out whether we're going to multiply or whether we're going to divide. And then back up here to these. Here we're not given the percent, so there's nothing to turn into a decimal, is there? Same with this one. So here, we can't move the decimal point. We're not turning anything into a rate. But we are going to take the 32 divided by 40, which will give us 0.8. Then we're going to move the decimal point to make that a percent. That'd be 80%. So you can see that rate method, to me, is extremely confusing. Now, it's the way I was taught it, so I actually do it that way most of the time because it is quicker if you're really good at it. But you've got to know, when do I multiply by the rate, when do I divide by the rate, and when do I divide the two numbers and move the decimal to make it a percent. Personally, I prefer to use the proportion method because it gives us less opportunity for mistake. In fact, when we get into story problems, that proportion method is actually extremely handy for setting up the work for the problem. For example, let's say that M&O Corporation estimates net income as 12% of gross sales. In a quarter, where net income is estimated to be $48,000. Find gross sales. So in a problem like this, we have the percent. 12% is 12 out of 100. But what is that percent representing? It's 12% of gross sales. So it's not representing gross sales. It's something out of gross sales. The net income is being represented by the 12%. Net income is estimated as 12% of something. So the 12 represents the net income. And that is out of gross sales. So the 100 represents gross sales. So now on the other side, when I go to set up my proportion, I have the 48,000. Does that represent net income or gross sales? Net income is estimated to be $48,000. So now I'm going to cross multiply and divide. 100 times 48,000 is 4,800,000. Divided by 12 is $400,000. So gross sales would have been around $400,000 that quarter. So you can see here, if you get good at identifying what the percents stand for in the problem, matching up the other numbers are relatively easy.
So,
yeah.
Do we have to understand the rate method?
No, you don't need to understand the rate method.
Okay.
There are some applications in real life, in application, where you use the rate method just because it's quicker to use that decimal. But it's almost always that first couple of examples where you're finding the rate and then multiplying a number by the rate. Like interest, 8%, you're just going to take your number times 0.08. Or commission, if you have a 12% commission, you're going to take your sales times 0.12. But it's almost always going to be going in that direction. So some for you to try in your notes. Blank is 35% of 80. 12 is 20% of blank. And 13 is blank percent of 104. Give each of those a try in your notes. Okay, so first one. 35% is 35 over 100 equals 80 goes top or bottom? Bottom. Cross, multiply, and divide. We're going to get 28. Very good. Next, 20%, so 20 over 100. Where's the 12 go? On top. Cross, multiply, and divide. We get 60. Very good. And finally, the percent is missing, so it's blank over 100. We have the 13 and the 104. Which one goes with the missing percent? 13 over 104. And we cross multiply and divide. We get 12.5. So it's 12.5%. Anybody have any questions on those? Okay. So then, let's say that the quality control department estimates 8% of parts produced have a defect. In a run of 2,400 parts. How many defective parts are expected? See what you come up with for that one, Claire. So how do we set this one up? So 8 over 100, yes. The 8 represents defectives, right? Now the 100 represents just the total parts. So what's on the other side now? Blank over 2,400, okay. And then what do? Cross multiply and divide gives us 190 what? 192, okay. 192. So we'd expect 192 to be defective. So, the DNR estimates what's that? They're estimating the deer population is way down. Yeah. The DNR estimates that 0.8% of deer are partially albino. If 7 deer have been identified as partially albino, how many total deer are in the area? So again, give that. So tell me how to set it up. 0.8 over 100, okay? Then what? 7 over blank, good. So we're going to cross multiply. 100 times 7 is 700, divided by 0.8, which is going to give us 875. Very good. How many have got 875? Beautiful. There is a new quiz due tomorrow, that is Wednesday, at 11:59 p.m. And there is a new homework due on Thursday at class time. I'll give you guys the last 15 minutes to get started on your homework or work on your quiz if you want to. The computer lab next door is open and ready to go.